I love coffee. I legitimately look forward to waking up just so I can have my first cup. Now, we take coffee very seriously in this house. We have a bun coffee maker. And I'm not talking about the bullshit consumer grade bun you get from Walmart that's basically an overpriced 12-cup Mr. Coffee. I'm talking about a legit commercial grade bun that makes nearly a whole fucking gallon of coffee in 5 minutes and puts it in an air pot that keeps it warm for hours without burning. It's even plumbed into a water line with double filtration to protect the coffee maker and the quality of the coffee itself. So when I say we take coffee seriously, what I mean is get out of here with your dinky little Keurig and your pods and that bullshit milk frother that comes on the side. But it will never cease to amaze me how some people out there, fully grown, tax-paying adults, simply do not know how to make coffee even in a simple drip coffee maker. I've watched people stumble into the break room, grab a bag of cheap grounds, blindly dump a completely random mound of dirt into the filter of a drip coffee maker, hit the brew button, and just hope for the best. What are you doing? You don't just dump and pray, you measure it like a civilized human being. A good reliable rule of thumb is a half cup of grounds for 12 cups of coffee. It matters. If you're going to consume a psychoactive stimulant, at least have the decency to prepare it correctly. Stop being a dumbass about making coffee. Now, once you have your perfectly measured cup in hand, you might start to wonder what that daily habit is actually doing to your heart. Following up on our last episode where we looked at the dangers of caffeine during extreme heat stress, today we are looking at the long-term chronic effects of caffeine on your cardiovascular system. The American Heart Association just dropped a massive scientific statement on this exact topic, and we are going to break it down. It's an all-new Prove It To Me. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Prove It To Me. I'm your host, Dr. Matt Law. In our last episode, we talked about caffeine in the context of acute occupational hazards, specifically how chugging a highly caffeinated gas station cocktail on a 95-degree job site can spike your core body temperature and mask the biological warning signs of heat exhaustion. But what about the long game? For the millions of us who drink a few cups of coffee every single day while sitting at a desk reviewing safety metrics or managing teams, what is that daily caffeine drip actually doing to our cardiovascular system? Now, to find out, I pulled a brand new manuscript titled Caffeine and Cardiovascular Disease, a scientific statement from the American Heart Association. This is a comprehensive review put together by a heavy-hitting panel of cardiologists, epidemiologists, and public health experts. Now, right out of the gate, the authors point out a massive complicating factor in caffeine research. While caffeine can be ingested in a pure synthetic form, it is overwhelmingly consumed through foods and beverages, primarily coffee. Coffee is a complex beverage. It contains chlorogenic acids, diterpenes, trigonylene, and other bioactive compounds that have their own distinct antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. So when we talk about the health effects of caffeine, we are very often actually talking about the health effects of coffee. Now let's dive into the pharmacology, the genetics, and the actual cardiovascular outcomes to see if your morning brew is helping or hurting you. Caffeine is technically a methylxanthine derivative, and it is the world's most popular psychoactive substance. When you drink a cup of coffee, the caffeine has 100% oral bioavailability. It is highly hydrophilic, meaning it rapidly dissolves and absorbs in your system, reaching peak blood concentrations in just 1 hour. Now, because it is highly lipophilic, it effortlessly crosses all biological membranes, including the blood-brain barrier. Once it is in your brain, it acts primarily as an adenosine receptor antagonist. Adenosine is the molecule that builds up in your brain throughout the day to make you feel tired. You may remember that from the last episode. Caffeine physically blocks those receptors, hitting the mute button on your body's fatigue signals. But how does it leave the body? Caffeine is extensively metabolized by the liver, specifically by a group of cytochrome P450 isoenzymes, with CYP1A2 doing the heavy lifting. Your liver breaks the caffeine down into 3 active metabolites: paraxanthine, theobromine, and theophylline, which are eventually excreted by your kidneys through your urine. Here is where the science gets really fascinating: the genetic lottery. Have you ever wondered why your coworker can drink a double espresso at 8 p.m. and sleep like a baby, while a single cup of green tea at noon gives you the jitters until midnight? It comes down to your DNA. The estimated heritability of caffeine consumption, toxicity, and tolerance is somewhere between 30% and 50%. Population-based genome-wide association studies have mapped our caffeine behaviors directly to specific genes, primarily the CYP1A2 and AHR genes. These genes dictate how much of that liver enzyme you produce, which completely controls the speed at which you metabolize caffeine. People who inherit the genetic variants for rapid metabolism clear caffeine from their bloodstream very quickly. Because their bodies eliminate it so fast, these individuals actually have to consume more caffeine to achieve the same psychostimulant effects as everyone else. Your genetics even influence behavioral nuances, like whether you prefer your coffee black or if you gravitate toward decaf. So, the next time someone brags about their massive caffeine tolerance, just remind them they aren't tough. Their liver is just genetically programmed to process metylxanthines faster than yours. Let's get into the actual cardiovascular outcomes, starting with blood pressure. We've all felt our heart rate tick up after a strong cup of coffee, so it is natural to assume caffeine causes long-term hypertension. The data says otherwise. The relationship between caffeine and blood pressure is highly dependent on how long you've been using it and what form it takes. If you take a caffeine-naive person, someone who never drinks it, and give them a strong dose, their systolic and diastolic blood pressure will absolutely spike. But for habitual daily coffee drinkers, the body develops a tolerance. In fact, long-term prospective cohort studies show an inverse J-shaped association between habitual coffee consumption and hypertension. That means people who drink 1 to 3 cups a day might have a very slightly elevated risk or no risk, but as consumption gets higher, the risk of hypertension actually trends downward. However, we have to draw a massive bold line between a cup of coffee and a modern energy drink. The AHA statement explicitly notes that consuming high concentration caffeine energy drinks results in significant increases in both systolic and diastolic blood pressure, even in healthy adults. Why the difference? Because energy drinks are engineered differently. They strip away the beneficial blood pressure lowering antioxidants found in the coffee bean, like chlorogenic acid, and replace them with massive, rapid onset caffeine doses mixed with taurine and other synthetic additives. If you are a safety professional managing a crew, moderate coffee in the morning is perfectly fine. But when the guys start pounding 300 milligram synthetic energy drinks before doing heavy labor, they are actively spiking their blood pressure. This next finding blew my mind, and it might change how you make your coffee tomorrow morning. We don't normally associate black coffee with cholesterol, But it turns out the way you brew your coffee has a direct measurable impact on your low-density lipoprotein, your LDL, or bad cholesterol. Coffee beans naturally contain a compound called caffeine. In double-blind randomized trials, researchers found that consuming caffeine directly increases LDL cholesterol concentrations. Here is the catch. Caffeine is effectively trapped and removed by paper coffee filters. If you drink standard paper-filtered drip coffee or instant coffee, there are no substantial amounts of caffeine in your cup, and it will not affect your cholesterol. But if you drink unfiltered coffee, like French press, Turkish coffee, or Scandinavian boiled coffee, you are getting a massive dose of caffeine. The AHA explicitly states that high consumption of unfiltered coffee consistently increases serum cholesterol in randomized trials. Espresso falls somewhere in the middle, containing a smaller amount of caffeine than a French press, and is associated with only modestly higher serum cholesterol. So, if you have high cholesterol and you are religiously plunging a French press every morning, you might want to switch back to a standard paper filter drip machine. And remember, measure the grounds. Half a cup for 12 cups of water. Now let's talk about type 2 diabetes, because this is where the coffee versus caffeine debate really shines. When you look at acute short-term clinical trials, dumping pure caffeine into the human body can actually reduce insulin sensitivity and mess with glucose metabolism. But when you look at massive long-term observational studies of people drinking actual coffee, the exact opposite happens. Habitual coffee consumption is consistently associated with a significantly lower risk of type 2 diabetes. A massive review of 28 cohort studies found a 20% decreased risk of diabetes for people drinking 3.5 cups a day, and a 30% decreased risk for people drinking 5 cups a day. How is this possible if caffeine impairs insulin sensitivity? Because it's not the caffeine doing the heavy lifting, it's the coffee bean. The AHA notes that these massive diabetes risk reductions are also observed in people who drink decaffeinated coffee. The protective effect comes from the bean's other components, particularly chlorogenic acid, which improves glucose metabolism, magnesium, and chromium, which are linked to insulin sensitivity. So, coffee is incredibly protective against diabetes, provided you aren't dumping 600 calories of caramel syrup and heavy cream into it every morning, which entirely defeats the purpose. Now let's round this out by looking at the big, scary cardiovascular diseases: arrhythmias, heart failure, and stroke. First, arrhythmias. For decades, doctors told patients with heart palpitations to stop drinking coffee. It turns out that was mostly bad advice. Observational studies and Mendelian randomization studies show that moderate caffeinated coffee consumption is actually associated with a lower risk of atrial fibrillation, or AFib. In fact, in a trial of patients scheduled for cardioversion, drinking at least 1 cup of coffee a day resulted in a 39% reduced risk of recurrent AFib compared to complete caffeine avoidance. However, there is a catch. While it lowers the risk of AFib, randomized trials have shown that caffeine can increase the frequency of premature ventricular contractions, or PVCs, those annoying, fluttering, skipped beats. And again, the AHA warns that extreme doses of caffeine from energy drinks or powders have been linked to lethal ventricular fibrillation and sudden death in case reports. Next, heart failure and coronary artery disease. If you drink coffee moderately, your risk of coronary artery disease is either unaffected or slightly lowered. The same goes for heart failure. A meta-analysis demonstrated a J-shaped curve for heart failure with the lowest risk observed in people who drink about 4 cups of coffee per day. Finally, stroke risk. A massive dose-response meta-analysis of 20 cohort studies revealed a U-shaped association between coffee consumption and stroke risk. The absolute lowest risk was observed at moderate consumption, around 3 to 4 cups a day, which corresponded to a very impressive 21% risk reduction for stroke. So, what is the final verdict from the American Heart Association? If you are healthy, moderate coffee consumption, up to 400 milligrams of caffeine, or about 3 to 5 8-ounce cups of coffee a day, is not just safe, it is actively associated with a lower risk of cardiovascular disease, stroke, heart failure, and type 2 diabetes. The danger doesn't lie in the coffee bean, it lies in the delivery system. The benefits disappear when you swap roasted beans for heavily processed, hyper-caffeinated energy drinks, or when you turn a healthy cup of black coffee into a 900-calorie milkshake. And for the love of all that is holy, use a paper filter if your cholesterol is high, and measure your coffee grounds properly. I'll link the full American Heart Association scientific statement in the show notes so you can review the pharmacology and the clinical outcomes for yourself. If you got something out of today's conversation, please take a second to rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It truly is the best way to help other safety and health professionals find the show. Stay safe, brew your coffee like you know what the fuck you are doing, and I'll catch you on the next one. Prove It To Me is produced by me, Matt Law. Original music by Wes London. You can find this podcast on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. Like what you've heard so far? Please like, subscribe, and follow wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Got questions about what we talked about or research that you want to share? Send an email to contact@proveitpod.com. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the host and its guests and do not necessarily represent the official position, opinion, or strategies of their employers or companies. Examples of research and data analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based on very limited, often single use case, and sometimes dated information. Assumptions made within this discussion about research and data analyses are not necessarily representative of the position of the host, the guests, or their employers or companies. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast. The presentation of the content by the guests does not necessarily constitute an active endorsement of the content by the host.